Dear participants, welcome to the launch of the UN Global Survey on Digital and Sustainable Trade Facilitation 2021. I am Sue from United Nations ESCAP, and on behalf of my colleagues from all regional commissions, I would like to warmly welcome you to this launch. Before we start, I would like to make a few housekeeping announcements. Kindly note, as an attendee, you are automatically muted. Please drop your questions in Q&A instead of chat, and we will pick it up along the way. The questions asked in the chat box will be picked up directly in the Q&A, or at the end of the event in the Q&A sessions. We will also record and make the recording and presentations on the event website soon. And at the end of the event, we will be sharing the evaluation form so that we can improve our work. Please help us to fill in the evaluation form. So now, as an introduction, we would like to share with you a video on the survey 2021. Thank you. Now I would like to introduce Ms. Amida Saisha Al-Siabana, Under Secretary General of the United Nations and Executive Secretary of Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific, who will be delivering the opening remarks.
Distinguished participants, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the launch of the 2021 UN Global Survey on Digital and Sustainable Trade Facilitation. It is my great pleasure to launch this fourth edition of the survey, a tool that builds on the collective efforts of all 5 UN regional commissions and many partner organizations to provide a comprehensive and forward-looking understanding of the state of implementation of trade facilitation. The COVID-19 pandemic has disrupted progress towards inclusive and sustainable development across the world, including by making it more difficult and costly to trade. The pandemic has shown how dependent we are on each other and how essential it is to keep international trade going in times of crisis, if only to ensure everyone can access essential supplies such as food, medicine, and vaccines. Trade facilitation has an essential role to play by cutting unnecessary red tape and simplifying import and export procedures. I'm therefore very pleased to report that this year's survey shows that despite the pandemic, countries around the world have continued to make progress. Distinguished participants, The UN Trade Facilitation Survey has evolved significantly since it was first conducted regionally in Asia and the Pacific back in 2012. The survey now covers not only the WTO Trade Facilitation Agreement, but also measures associated with the UN Treaty on Cross-Border Paperless Trade Facilitation in Asia and the Pacific, which entered into force earlier this year. The recent surveys have also paid special attention to sectors and groups with special needs, such as the agriculture sector, SMEs, and women traders. For the 2021 survey, the regional commissions worked with UNCTAD and others to develop an additional survey module focusing on trade facilitation measures in times of pandemic-induced crisis. Overall, thanks to excellent collaboration with a growing number of partners and governments, the survey now covers nearly 140 countries and 60 trade facilitation measures. Distinguished participants, although progress in trade facilitation between the period 2019 and 2021 is significant, implementation varies widely across countries and regions. Implementation of cross-border paperless trade remains a challenge everywhere, even though the COVID-19 pandemic highlighted how useful it can be to exchange documents electronically to reduce physical contact and the spread of the virus. Much more also needs to be done to facilitate SMEs and women's participation in international trade. Looking ahead, I certainly hope that the result of the 2021 survey will be helpful for all countries to design evidence-based trade facilitation policies that can make trade connectivity more resilient and inclusive. I encourage all leaders to take advantage of all available global and regional mechanisms to make progress, such as the WTO Trade Facilitation Agreement and the Framework Agreement on Facilitation of Cross-Border Paperless Trade in Asia and the Pacific. In closing, I would like to express my sincere thanks and appreciation to all our sister regional commissions for their collaboration on the global survey, as well as to UNCTAD, ICC, ADB, ASEAN, OCO, CAREC, and so many other organizations and experts for excellent cooperation. I look forward to our continued partnerships to translate the survey results into meaningful policies and actions. Thank you very much.
I thank Ibu Amida for setting the scene for this launch. We will be now moving to the presentations from each regional commissions. Let me first introduce Mr. Jan Duval, Art Interim Director of Trade, Investment, Innovation Division of ESCAP, to present the overview of global survey results and in the Asia-Pacific region.
Thank you, Sue. I hope you can see the slides and hear me well. I'm very pleased to be here. So I'm going to try and take less than 15 minutes to present to you the overview of global results, right, of the Trade Facilitation Survey. So let me start right away, including a little bit on Asia-Pacific region, because ESCAP is responsible for that region in particular. So a small reminder on the survey scope. As mentioned by the Executive Secretary a few minutes ago in her remarks, the survey covers 50 plus trade facilitation measures and 140 plus countries, right? But most importantly, it is WTO TFA plus, right? It goes beyond the WTO Trade Facilitation Agreement provisions to include more advanced digital trade facilitation measures, specifically paperless trade measures and also cross-border paperless trade measures. It also includes sustainable trade facilitation measures. So these measures targeted to SMEs, to agriculture sector, to women, and also as a component on trade finance facilitation. In addition to this, for 2021, indeed, we've added one more component, covering trade facilitation measures during crisis and pandemic. And then, obviously, this is linked to the COVID-19 crisis. A little bit of a reminder also on the type of survey and the data collection that we follow. We typically follow a three-step approach. This is not a perception survey. This is a fact-based survey to the extent possible. So during step one, what is done is we openly collect the data from all willing experts and relevant experts from public, private sector that give us feedback and information on what type of trade facilitation measures are being implemented in the countries that they are familiar with. And then we move to a step two and this is where the hard work comes from the UN regional commissions and partners, is cross-checking and verification of the data that is given to us by the experts. We also collect our own data through publications we find and regulations we find on different countries, right? We are responsible for. And at the end of step two, what we have is we have a national data set for each country survey, right? And the third step, final step, which is also very important, is that we send that national data set for final validation by countries, right? And so countries validate the data set, and in some cases provide additional information, feedback, and there's some revisions, again, to the extent possible, all based on fact. So that's an overview of the methodology. So what are the key results, right? What we find is the global average for 2021 stands at 65%. So that's the global average of the implementation rate of digital and of general and digital trade facilitation measures. So it does not include sustainable trade facilitation measures and measures related to COVID-19, but the core set of measures, so WTO TFA related measures plus all the digital trade facilitation measures, we see overall implementation rate of 65% across 140 plus countries that we have in the database. What we also find, and you can see in the slide here, is you can see quite a bit of variation across developing country groups and also developed economies. And so you find that Southeast and East Asia is actually leading the developing region with 75% implementation rate. Against, for example, developed economies together average 81-82% implementation, right? So quite a bit of variation. Pacific Islands, only 44% implementation. Sub-Saharan Africa, only 48% implementation, right? So quite a bit of variation overall. If you look at the trend from 2015 to 2021, because that's the data that we now have, right, since with this initiative, you see continuous progress, including between 2019 and 2021, right? So between 2019 and 2021, we see a 5 percentage point improvement, right, in the overall implementation rate between 2019 and 2021. So that's good news because the COVID-19 happened right during that time, and so we expected that maybe we would see very little progress, but luckily progress has continued actually in all regions. Right? So this shows how progress has continued in all the regions. And the interesting thing here is that actually, if you find that we find that Pacific Islands and South Asia are the two world developing regions that are actually made the most progress. So that's very good news because they are also, except for Sub-Saharan Africa, they are the one, they are at the bottom of the implementation of trade facilitation, right? So in a way, there is some catching up process here from the Pacific Island and in South Asia that is very much welcome. Now, if you look at trade facilitation implementation in countries with special needs, so least developed country, landlocked developing countries, special small island developing states, you find that yes, as a group, they are all below the world implementation rate average. LLDCs are doing quite well. That's obviously can be attributed to the fact that landlocked developing countries very much depend on trade facilitation, right? So they are trying to do their best in this area. LDCs are struggling, right? 49% implementation rate. which means that really they need help, especially in measures like paperless trade, cross-border paperless trade, they often lack some of the infrastructure. Now, if you look a little bit in more details, right? General and digital trade facilitation measures. We show the average implementation rate of the different subgroups of trade facilitation measures here. And what we find is the groups of measures that are directly related to the WTO trade facilitation agreement, like transparency measures, formality simplification, institutional arrangement, like establishment of national trade facilitation committees. The implementation rate is quite high, higher than for the average of all the trade facilitation measures. But if you start talking about paperless trade, and if you even look at cross-border paperless trade, which is about the exchange of electronic data and documents, not within your country or within the country, but across borders, you find much lower implementation rate. And that's obviously because you need to have intergovernmental agreements between countries in order to really make this happen properly. Just showing this slide to invite you to actually visit the untfsurvey.org website, where you can see some maps of implementation of different groups of measures. So this is the one on cross-border paperless trade, and that shows actually that Asia Pacific is doing quite well in this area. Now, if I move to implementation of sustainable and resilient trade facilitation measures, so this is the measures that are actually not included in the overall implementation rates, right, that we show for the countries, right? And then what we see here is the little red lines here shows the average implementation of each group of measures, right? And so you can see all the red lines are below the green line. And the green line shows the average implementation implementation rate of all the trade facilitation measures on average. So all those sustainable and resilient trade facilitation measures are lack in implementation, essentially, right? With trade facilitation measures targeted at SMEs and trade facilitation measures targeted at women traders in particular quite low. And then I can see here that we put challenge on the trade finance facilitation. So that is also very low. And this relates to the fact that there is a disconnect between the trade finance community on one hand and the trade facilitation community on the other hand, right? So, and so, for example, very few single windows have embedded into them facilities and facilities to actually access trade finance, right? So there is a need to make a lot more improvement in this area. Now, on trade facilitation, so I'm skipping this one because of time. This is just an illustration of trade facilitation for SMEs measures you can find on the website and through the surveys, right? I want to spend a little bit of time on resilient trade facilitation measures, which is this additional component on trade facilitation in time of crisis that we added to the survey as part of our COVID-19 response, right? And so here what we find clearly is that work is needed on making trade procedures more resilient. And I think a key number that we have at the global level is that only 16% of the countries have confirmed long-term preparedness for future crises. So only 16% of the countries actually have a plan in place, a crisis plan in place to respond to future crises. So hopefully the COVID-19 is going to prompt countries to develop preparatory plans for future crises. Because of time, I will not go through all the lists of implemented trade facilitation measures that we have across the different groups. I just want to highlight my favorite one, which is the one measure that is related to establishment and publication of average release time, which is really about being transparent about your trade facilitation performance and publishing how efficient your trade procedures are. And unfortunately, that measure remains, which is part of the WTO trade, one of the measures in the WTO trade facilitation agreement, actually remains among the least implemented measures in the global survey. And so hopefully this can change as time passes. I'm not mentioning here, it's not specified in the table, but single window. I know a lot of people are interested in single window, right? Implementation remains one of the least implemented measures, but not the very least implemented measures in our survey, but a lot of work needs to be done still in this area. A little bit on the trade facilitation implementation in Asia and the Pacific. So I'm just showing here the implementation rate across all the countries, Asia Pacific countries we have in the survey. So you can see quite a bit of variation. Again, with Pacific Island catching up, but still quite a bit behind, right? As I mentioned before. Overall, the Asia Pacific region has progressed essentially in line with the global trend. So the region is keeping up with the trend, not exceeding the trend necessarily, but keeping up with it. But I think the good news also is that 7 of 13 countries in the global survey who achieve implementation rates greater than 90% are actually in the Asia Pacific region, right? So I'm not naming them, but we have the flags in the presentation, right? So I guess I mean on this point, actually, it's very important that the countries, who are doing very well on trade facilitation, I mean, pass on their knowledge and their experience to the other countries who are lagging behind, right? And one way to do this, obviously, is through the UN Treaty and Framework Agreement on Facilitation of Cross-Border Paperless Trade in Asia and the Pacific. I will not go any further. I think I invite you to take a deeper look at your own economy data that should be online. We have launched a completely new website that is multilingual now. So we've got French as of 10 minutes ago. We've got Russian as well. So there might still be a few bugs. So let us know if you find a few bugs. But please go visit the website to see the extensive data that is there. In terms of, I just want to end by saying that this is, right now we're just releasing the data, right? The deep analysis, detailed analysis of all the information we received will come in September in global reports, in regional reports, and that will include good practices, right? So we've identified through the survey a number of good practices in each of the areas. So the slide here shows good practices related to COVID-19 and crisis response by Philippines, Indonesia, and China. And so some of those information will be featured on the website in the global reports in the coming weeks and months. So on that note, let me stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jan. So now I will be moving on. I am pleased to introduce Mr. David Luke, Coordinator of African Trade Policy Center of Economic Commission for Africa, ECA, to share with us the overview in Africa. David, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much, Sue, and good morning, good afternoon, greetings to everyone, and to the ESCAP Executive Secretary with appreciation for her opening remarks. Let me also add my thanks to Jan Duval, who has been spearheading this initiative since 2015, and to all the colleagues from all the other regional organizations that have been part of this effort. And yes, what I'll be presenting is the African report as part of the global survey on digital trade and sustainable trade facilitation. Let me begin with a few opening remarks before I get into the presentation. Firstly, to say that this year's survey is taking place as efforts are being made to implement the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement. Our most recent analysis through computable general equilibrium modeling at ECA estimates that inter-African trade would increase by 250 billion, that's over 63%, if trade liberalization on goods and services is accompanied by significant cuts in actionable restrictions in NTMs, non-tariff measures, which of course constitute trade facilitation measures. So the gains that could be had from improving trade facilitation enormous, and clearly, if the African Continental Free Trade Area is to make the kind of impact we expect it to make, then clearly we need to see more progress on trade facilitation reform. Second point I'd like to make before I turn to the presentation of the results is that compared to the previous global surveys, 8 new African countries have reported on their current status of trade facilitation implementation measures. So now we have a total of 34 countries represented in the region. Now, this is the highest response rate that we have ever had since we started this initiative. Now, coming to the first of the 5 slides that I'll be presenting on the implementation of trade facilitation in Africa. Just a small caveat before I make the substantive points, and that is that ECA's mandate is for the whole of Africa. So at ECA, we do not use the term sub-Saharan Africa, just to make this clear. And as you would see from this slide, that in fact our effort has been for the whole of Africa. We try to cover all the countries of Africa, and so the results I'll be presenting you in line with ECA's mandate is for the whole of Africa. So this slide shows the average score of trade facilitation implementation by country and sub-region on the African continent. The continent scored an average implementation of the core trade facilitation measures of 51%. The countries with the high score were Mauritius with 88% and Morocco with 83%. Sub-regional differences, of course, may be skewed based on who participated in the survey. However, differences can still be identified in addition to the differences between countries. The highest performing region is North Africa, with an average implementation of 64%, followed by Southern Africa with 62%. These regions are performing better, particularly in the categories of cross-border paperless trade and paperless trade, where other regions are not as far in their implementation of these measures, whereas other regions are not as far in their implementation of these measures. So these results, of course, are only representative of those countries that have participated in the survey and do not necessarily represent all the member states on the continent. Now let me turn to the next, the second of the 5 slides, and this is average rates by measure, grouped by category. So these figures give us an indication of potential bottlenecks in the implementation of the AFCFTA, which, as I said, is the major trade initiative currently on the continent. Of course, I cannot overemphasize the point how important trade facilitation is for implementing the AFCFTA. So here, what we see in the slide is that formalities and institutional arrangement and cooperation have the highest implementation scores with 63% and 60%, which is crucial for improving administrative procedures such as risk management and establishment of national trade facilitation committees. Cross-border paperless trade is the lowest implemented score of the core trade facilitation measures at 24%. So it will be crucial to accelerate implementation of the cross-border paperless trade measures, such as ensuring electronic certificate of origin, which is an important aspect for accelerating preferential trade, such as under the FCFTA on the rules of origin. Improving implementation of these measures will furthermore eliminate the burdensome customs procedures and excessive paperwork to ensure easier flow of goods between countries on the African continent. I'll now go to the third of the 5 slides. And this is the comparison of the average implementation rate of the core trade facilitation measures, taking all the surveys that we have done from 2015 up to 2021. So what we see here is that the pace of implementation of trade facilitation measures has declined significantly from 2019 to 2021. Compared to the improvements that we saw from 2017 to 2019. This trend, perhaps we could attribute to the COVID-19 pandemic, where Africa suffered from supply shocks and its first economic recession in 25 years. While North and Southern Africa have achieved the highest improvement in implementing trade facilitation measures with an increase of 15 and 12% respectively, the East African region has achieved the highest increase in trade facilitation implementation since 2019 with 52%. The 28 African countries that participated both in 2019 and 2021 increased their average implementation rate from 49% to 51% compared to 2019. These increases can be identified in the implementation rates of the categories of paperless trade, 51% up from 45%, formalities, 65% up from 62%, institutional arrangement and cooperation, 64% up from 61%, transparency, 57% up from 56%, and cross-border paperless trade, which remains unchanged at 24%. I now come to the fourth of the fifth of the 5 slides, which looks at status of implementation in regard to SME measures. And of course, SMEs account for a huge percentage, over 80% of the region's businesses, and so play a key role in the economy and development of African countries. And indeed, the AFCFTA is meant to open up opportunities for SMEs. As I've already mentioned, COVID-19 have particularly impacted trade in Africa, as businesses have relied on overseas suppliers, and they have suffered from challenging access to these suppliers. These challenges to global and regional trade in Africa can be identified in the decline in trade, where commodity exports declined by 17% in 2020. So promoting trade facilitation implementation by specifically targeting SMEs to accelerate inter-African trade and tap into value-adding supply chains will be crucial to support a more inclusive and sustainable economic growth on the continent. The regional score on trade facilitation for FMEs is lagging behind, and so there's going to be need to create an appropriate ecosystem for African SMEs to tap into regional markets and be able to prosper. Ensuring representation of SMEs in national trade facilitation committees is underway at 42% implementation. However, ensuring an inclusive representation in these national trade facilitation committees by taking measures to ensure that women and SME representatives will be important to ensure that the trade facilitation measures are effective to the majority of the business sector. Taking actions to make the single window more accessible to SMEs by developing interface for mobile phones or tablets is implemented at a fairly low score of 31%. Nonetheless, we know that mobile applications for SMEs in Africa have proven highly successful, with over 90% mobile penetration with over 90% of mobile penetration rate. This makes Africa a prospective mobile market, which will be strengthened further with the AFCFTA protocol on e-commerce that we expect to be negotiated during the latter part of this year. So improving single market access to SMEs in Africa could have a significant impact on increasing intra-African trade. So I come now to the final and concluding slide, and just to make some concluding points. So overall, in line with what Jan Duval presented, we see slight progress in trade facilitation implementation. I'll take you into account, of course, the COVID-19 implications. Compared to the global level of trade facilitation implementation, Africa is lagging behind, so we do have challenges on this continent. Paperless trade has increased since 2019 from 45% to 51%. But more efforts are needed to ensure that trade facilitation measures target women and SMEs as we have seen. So let me stop here. And once again, thank you for listening to me. I'm sorry you've not been able to see me, and that's because I have a problem with the camera on the laptop I'm using. But I hope that you heard me clearly. And of course, you've been able to follow the presentation itself. And once again, my thanks to the team at TCA that has worked on the survey, and also to all colleagues that have been part of this collaborative venture. Thank you very much, and over to you, Sue.
Thank you, David. Yes, it is indeed collaborative efforts, and it is indeed a pleasure to have ECA's presentation be heard. Now I move to ECE. It is my pleasure to introduce Ms. Elizabeth Turk, Director of Economic Cooperation and Trade Division of Economic Commission for Europe, UNECE, for an overview in UNECE region.
Many thanks, Sue, and many thanks also for your assistance, your colleagues' assistance in moving with the slides. Let me start here to say it's a great pleasure for me to participate, and also mention once again a big thank you to ESCAP for organizing today's event, and also for the leadership and guidance you have provided throughout that process of the UN's Global Survey on Digital and Sustainable Trade Facilitation. It's been great for UNECE to be part of this effort, and in fact, it's a wonderful collaboration among the United Nations 5 regional economic commissions. And I feel we can also join hands in terms of next steps. And let me here recall what we just heard from the Executive Secretary from ESCAP in her opening remarks, where she said we have to transfer the findings into meaningful activities. So I think that's really key. We have with us now a host of data, and all of us individually and jointly can contribute to working with our membership to putting in place the relevant actions. And as you surely all know, the United Nations Center for Trade Facilitation and Electronic Business, that's UNCFACT, it's a subsidiary intergovernmental body of UNECE. UNCFACT offers a host of recommendations and e-business standards, which also, amongst others, focus on cross-border paperless trade. And I think UNCFACT can be very valuable in terms of providing some tools to assist countries all over the globe, because UNCFACT is with global membership to kind of like do better on trade facilitation. Now, before we go into the substance, let me also thank the UNECE team for their contribution. That includes Salihin Khan, who is the focal point from our side on the survey. He's been managing it from A to Z. That also includes Charles Frey, who is essential in terms of implementing all these steps that we heard from Jan Duval before, and Daniela Stratulatif, who is our consultant with very valuable experience on trade facilitation in ITC, European Commission, and also African Development Bank. Now, if I talk about the UNECE region, Let me give you one piece of information and background here. When we talk about the UNECE region, we really talk about UNECE's 56 member countries in the pan-European region. And that includes, importantly, also countries in North America, United States and Canada, then the EU countries, the EFTA countries, as well as a large number of countries in the eastern part of Europe, notably the Russian Federation, as well as countries in Central Asia, Southern Caucasus, Western Balkan, and Eastern Europe. And the fact that the data will be available also in Russian, I think, is really a great initiative for the countries in UNECE. Now, from our 56 member countries, 44 have responded to the survey. So I can echo here what David Luke just mentioned. This is more than in the previous survey for us. And I'm glad to mention that some of the newcomers include relatively small economies such as Andorra and Luxembourg. And it's nice to see how really the relevance of the survey is increasingly seen in a wide variety of ECE member countries. Now, if we move to the next slide, we thought we start with what the survey shows in terms of trade facilitation in times of crisis and in times of the pandemic. That's really something on all of our radar screens. And in this category, we've heard before, it's a new category. The respondents indicate, for example, whether the government has assigned an agency to implement and manage trade facilitation measure in times of crisis, or they respond with respect to the publication of emergency, including COVID-19 related trade facilitation measures, coordination with measures of other countries, and very importantly, the additional cross-border paperless trade measures. So here it's interesting to look at the results because also for the UNECE region, the implementation levels in this category, they vary widely across the region. We have an average of 46%, but this 46%, in fact, this masks some of the top performers with 93%, and some of those countries where performance is relatively low, namely with 13%. So what we can see here is that really more needs to be done, and particularly in the survey responses, we also saw that some of our membership is not implementing any trade facilitation measure for safeguarding for future crises. So that's somewhat worrying, and let me flag here that one of the UNECE instruments could be coming in quite handy here, and notably that's the recently adopted UN CFACT recommendation number 47. It's entitled Pandemic Crisis Trade-Related Response. And I'm very pleased to mention here that as UN CFACT is sort of like a collaborative effort, we have benefited in the development of this recommendation also from comments from colleagues from ESCAP and from UNCTAD. And I very much hope that we can also join hands when it comes to rolling out this UN CFACT recommendation on pandemic crisis and trade-related response. And I hope that jointly we can assist our membership to do better in terms of being better prepared for future crises. So if we move to the next slide, that really brings us to the bulk of the trade facilitation survey. And we can see the trends over time for different regions in the UNECE region. And here, two positive messages to share. First of all, since the 2019 survey, the level of trade facilitation implementation for the ECE region improved. It improved from around 73 to 76%. So that's generally at a relatively high level, and it's an improvement, maybe not a massive improvement, but it's definitely an improvement to be mentioned. It gets interesting when we look at the individual sub-regions that you have on the chart here. And again, I'm pleased to say a positive message that all of our sub-regions recorded progress. And particularly interesting to look at Central Asia, that's the third sort of like bar on the chart here. Central Asia registered an increase of around 16%. So I think that's significant, that's good. I think we heard from Jan Dival before some numbers about 10 and 9% increases in some other countries. And I guess the 16% increase for Central Asia is really outstanding. In the UNECE region, that's followed by increase of 6% in North America and 5% in Caucasus and Turkey. Now, a small caveat, having mentioned this significant increase about Central Asia, if you look at the chart, you can see that generally Central Asia, as well as some of the Eastern European and Western Balkan countries, are still lagging behind. They have around 64% of implementation, while some of the other UNECE regions are doing much better with around 80% of implementation. So surely we have to do more in terms of assisting our membership to do better. And I'm pleased to say that UNECE, with our work on technical assistance and capacity building, we are delighted to taking that forward. And for example, when it comes to Central Asia, we have most recently developed a national trade facilitation roadmaps for Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan. We are supporting the National Trade Facilitation Council of Kyrgyz Republic to implement WTO TFA. And of course, together with colleagues from ESCAP, we are servicing SPECA. That's the United Nations Special Program for Economies in Central Asia. And SPECA, very importantly, has a trade facilitation strategy. So I think that's also a tool that can really help us bring Central Asia to an even higher implementation rate. Now, if we move to the next slide, it's again a very interesting slide. And at the beginning, I would say it's also a quite confusing slide, but we've seen variations of it already before. So here you see again the different sub-regions of the ECE region, always with a thicker bar giving the average and the country-specific columns next to it. And what you can see here is also that each bar has different colors, and that's referring to the 5 categories, which we've already referred to before: transparency, formalities, institutional arrangements and cooperation, and paperless trade and cross-border trade. And the different colors show the percentage of implementation for each category relative to the full implementation for the 5 categories. Now, since the number of measures varies in the categories, also the weights of the categories varies. We have to take this in consideration. So what are the takeaway messages here? If we look at transparency, that's the dark blue part, most countries have quite similar implementation levels. The same for formalities and institutional arrangements. So we can see that those are really sort of quite similar across the UNECE region. However, if we look at the categories of paperless trade, and particularly cross-border paperless trade measures, that's the green and the turquoise part of the bars, here the implementation really varies significantly in the different sub-regions. And I think we've heard already the importance that should be given to those 2 categories before. And I would say again here, we stand ready to support membership to get higher implementation rates. It's clear that these digital trade facilitation matters, they surely present additional challenges. You need adequate ITC infrastructure, and that's maybe something where really more work is needed. Here, important to mention also that several countries in the UNECE region, they have reached over 90% implementation already here, but none has reached full implementation. Thinking about UNECE tools and UNCFAC tools that can help here, I would say most of UNCFAC deliverables can help. We have these important e-business standards. They really support systematic digitalization, simplification, harmonization of trade facilitation measures. Now, if we move to the next slide, that slide, it's interesting for 2 messages, and we've heard already earlier presenters speak about. First, here in each of the category, we have the different measures, and the circles represent these different measures. And we can see the implementation for each measure varies significantly in the different categories. The transparency measures, for example, they have quite similar implementation. That's on the very left-hand side of the chart. You can see the visuals sort of like almost being plugged together. While in other categories, such as cross-border paperless trade, there is a large variation between levels of implementation. They are sort of like spread out, the blue dots, and that also would allow us to identify clearly the entry points where more needs to be done. Now, secondly, we see that overall implementation also varies between the categories. Transparency ranks top. That's maybe no surprise. We've heard that before. Categories such as trade facilitation measures for women in trade, trade finance, that's on the right-hand side part of the visual, they really are lagging behind and there is scope for improvement. And I was very inspired by also what we heard from David before about the importance given to these type of measures and topics. So here I would state that indeed more needs to be done, and we are delighted to join hands in this regard. Now, there's 2 more slides, and if we move to the next one, this is really to help us identify the most implemented measures and the least implemented measures in each category. You can see the different parts of the table here. And I think that helps us to identify success stories, and it helps us identify entry points for further action. On the left-hand side, you can see highlighted in light blue those measures that are now being implemented by all countries. So where we do have 100% implementation rate. Very interesting, but not surprisingly, I guess, there are 2 measures in the paperless trade category that are increased in priority during the pandemic and that are now being implemented across the region. These are internet connection available to customs and electronic submission of customs certificate. If we move to the last slide, it's very similar to the slide before, but just we are not looking at the general trade facilitation measures, but we are looking at these additional new categories, the other category that looks at sustainability and SMEs and women. And what's interesting to flag is that trade facilitation measures for SMEs and women in trade, although the most implemented in the respective categories, they have been fully implemented by only very few countries. So we know that these are 2 important topics, SMEs and women in trade. They're very important also for the UN and for trade negotiations more broadly, but we can see that very few countries are sort of like implementing them fully. Now, again, let me flag here some elements, some tools that can possibly be useful from the UNCFACT side. On the one hand, the white paper on integrated services for MSMEs in international trade. And secondly, the e-business standards for agriculture, like eCert standard for agricultural trade and SPS certificates. And I think that links up to what we've heard from David for the African region before. Finally, also worryingly, and I think that's been mentioned and flagged by other speakers, as regards the trade facilitation in times of crisis and the pandemic, it's also a very low implementation rate is the preparedness of future trade facilitation for future crises. Only 47% of the countries are working on this, and only 20% are prepared with adequate trade facilitation measures for building up resilience and for safeguarding from future crises. And so I would say that's really worrying, and that's maybe an area for us, the regional commissions, to join hands to support our membership. And recommendation 47 from UNCFACT might be a tool to boost preparedness. Now, last slide to conclude. If we look at the responses to the 21 survey in the UNECE region, what do we see? First of all, trade facilitation implementation improved in all of our sub-regions in the pan-European region. But some regions still have a very low level of implementation in both the general and digital trade facilitation measures. And here, let me flag Eastern and Southern Eastern Europe, the Western Balkan countries, and Central Asia. And while Central Asia has done very well, more needs to be done to improve. And secondly, in 2021, more trade facilitation measures are being implemented by all countries. So that's again a positive message, and very positive that 2 paperless trade facilitation measures are now amongst the most implemented. And I would say that their importance, that the recognition of their importance, that really, really increased during the pandemic. In terms of way forward, based on the analysis of the survey, we can identify a number of priority actions. I would say SMEs, women in trade, trade facilitation in times of crisis, and implementation of the digital measures. So what can we do to increase SME preparedness in the global supply chains? Support is required, for example, for access to the single window, authorized operator certification, and also representation in National Trade Facilitation Council. For women in trade facilitation category, again, a relatively low level of implementation. We do need government policies to increase women participation in trade facilitation, and also women membership in the national trade facilitation committees. For the sustainability dimension and trade facilitation in times of crisis, again, something that needs to be addressed on a priority basis to avoid future disruptions in trade. I've already mentioned the UNECE CFACT recommendation 47. And last but not least, implementation of paperless and cross-border paperless trade measures must be accelerated to increase also the resilience in future emergencies and pandemic, and much of UN CFACT is relevant here. So to conclude, all highly important topics, encouraging findings in the UNECE region, but also clearly some important entry points where more can be done. And I would like to close by thanking again ESCAP for the wonderful coordinating role and this amazing partnership between the regional economic commissions and also UNCTAD. And we in UNECE, together with UN CFACT, we stand ready to join hands to support our membership to further increase implementation rate and allow countries to harness the benefits of trade and trade facilitation for a sustainable, inclusive, and resilient recovery. Many thanks.
Thank you, Elizabeth. As you have said, the CFACT recommendation 47 on pandemic crisis and other initiatives, I hope it would be really supporting the post-pandemic recovery of the countries globally. Let me now move on to share the presentation from Mr. Sebastian Herreros, Economic Affairs Officer of Trade and Integration Division of Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, ECLAC. He's not able to join us due to the time differences, but any questions relevant to the vision will be answered after the event.
Good afternoon. My name is Sebastián Herreros, and I work at the Trade and Integration Division of the United Nations Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, UNECLAC, in Santiago, Chile. It is my pleasure presenting to you the preliminary results of the Global Survey 2021 for Latin America and the Caribbean. This year, we had the participation of 14 countries from our region in this fourth edition of the Global Survey. In order to give you a broader regional perspective, we have included in this chart 7 other countries which participated in the third edition of the Global Survey back in 2019. As you can see, across those 21 countries, the average implementation rate is quite high, 72%, with several countries well above that regional average. Same as on previous occasions, Mexico tops the list at 91%, and as you can see, there are several other countries with implementation rates above 80%. At the other end, there are 6 countries from the Caribbean which close the list. Caribbean countries, especially the small island countries from the Caribbean, face a number of challenges in implementing trade facilitation measures. And well, 11 countries from our region participated both in the third and the fourth editions of the Global Survey, and those are the countries on which we are going to focus for the remainder of this presentation. And the first, what you see here in this chart is the scores obtained by those 11 countries in the third and fourth editions of the Global Survey and the respective averages. As you can see, all countries made good progress from one edition of the survey to the next. Across the board, across the 11 countries, there was a 7 percentage point increase in the regional average from 74% up to 81.5%. The best results obtained by those 11 countries are as you could expect, were obtained in the areas most closely aligned with the disciplines of the WTO Trade Facilitation Agreement. So in the case of formalities, for instance, This is where the group obtains its best performance, its best implementation rate at 92%, up from 84% back in 2019, followed by transparency measures in which the region, or the 11 countries from the region, obtain an average implementation rate of 90%. Paperless trade is also quite high at 89%. These 11 countries show very high implementation rates for several trade facilitation measures, in some cases 100% implementation rate. This is the case, for example, of the electronic submission of air cargo manifests and the electronic submission of sea cargo manifests, the provisions for expedited shipments, trade facilitation measures for authorized operators. All 11 countries have those regimes in place. And then, well, you see nearly universal coverage of measures such as e-payment of customs duties and fees, post-clearance audits, separation of release from final determination of duties and rates, the use of risk management techniques, the use of advanced rulings on tariff classification, and the national trade facilitation committees, where all countries have them in place, and most of them consider that the national trade facilitation committees are fully operating. Just one country reported partial implementation. Other highly implemented measures concern the existence of an independent appeal mechanism for customs resolutions, the use of pre-arrival processing, the publication of trade regulations on the internet, even the electronic single window, which is quite a challenging measure from a technical point of view, from a financial, even from a interagency coordination point of view, has quite a high implementation rate at 88%. At the other end, the least implemented measures, or the areas where least progress has been made, concern digitalization of trade procedures and inclusiveness measures. This chart shows you the least implemented measures in the fourth edition of the global survey, and you can see that, for example, there you have the electronic application and issuance of SPS certificates, the electronic exchange of certificates of origin, electronic application for customs refunds, electronic exchange of SPS certificates, and the electronic exchange of customs declarations. As you can observe, implementation rates are not that low for some of those measures, but still they are among the least implemented measures in the region. So this is clearly an area where more needs to be done. And concerning inclusiveness-related measures, you see, for example, that the participation of small and medium enterprises in national trade facilitation committees scores just a 33% implementation rate, and the existence of trade facilitation measures aimed at female traders scores even lower at 27%. Measures to facilitate the access of small and medium enterprises to the authorized economic operator scheme, even lower, 18%. And then two other measures. The two measures where the least progress has been made concern government border agencies delegating their control functions to customs agencies, which is practically non-existent in the case of Latin America, and the single window facilitating the access to trade finance, which is something which doesn't exist at all at this point in the region. Some final remarks. As you may have seen in this presentation, Latin America obtains a high average in this fourth edition of the Global Survey, which reflects real progress since the previous edition of the survey 2 years ago. However, we need to be mindful that in this most recent edition of the survey, the Caribbean was underrepresented. We had just 2 countries from the Caribbean participating, as opposed to some 6 countries in 2019. So this very high regional implementation rate is partly a reflection of the low participation of Caribbean countries. So what I mean to say is that the regional situation is not as good as one could conclude from the results of this 4th edition of the Global Survey, because we know Caribbean countries are lagging behind the rest of the region. If they face unique challenges because of their small size, because of being island states and the like. So we know that the Caribbean still is struggling with implementing some trade facilitation measures, but this is something we cannot observe from the results of the 4th edition, simply because Caribbean countries could not participate. And I take the opportunity to note that COVID-19 took a toll on this on regional participation in the survey, in the sense that we had fewer countries participating this time around that back in 2019, and that was especially the case for Caribbean economies. That was one caveat. And the second caveat is that despite quite a good overall performance, much remains to be done on the areas of cross-border paperless trade and on the inclusiveness dimensions of trade facilitation. One good thing is that as a result of the pandemic, all the countries in the region have implemented measures towards digitalization of trade procedures, and we hope that those measures are going to be made permanent once the pandemic is finally over. Finally, something good to note is that there has been some encouraging progress, not just at the national level, but also at the regional level. And I would just like to mention 2 examples. One is in the area of authorized economic operators. There are mutual recognition agreements in place within the Andean community, within Mercosur, and within the Pacific Alliance. And now there is an ongoing negotiation of a region-wide MRA. And secondly, there's some electronic exchange of trade documents like certificates of origin, SPS, and the like within regional integration agreements, especially Central America and the Pacific Alliance. So on this positive note, I would like to conclude and thank you for your attention. Thank you very much.
It's great to hear from ECLAC region. As we can see in the global trends, I think it is reflected in all regional trends as well, that it is challenging for the cross-border paperless trade measures. And then we have further ways to develop to engage more countries to enhance the survey. So thank you very much. And then now, last but not least, I would like to introduce Mr. Mokhtar Mohamed El Hassin, leader of Shared Economic Prosperity Cluster of Economic and Social Commission for Western Asia, ESCAP, for an overview in the Arab region. Mokhtar, you are muted. Mokhtar, you are muted.
Okay.
Thank you.
I am unmuted now.
Yes, I can hear you very clearly.
Thank you, So. I'd like first to start by thanking ESCAP for their leadership and their great support during the process of this survey. Also, of course, thank you to the Executive Secretary of ESCAP for her speech to set the scene for this event. We in ESCAP are very happy to be part of the process to contribute with data and perspective on trade facilitation in the Arab region, together with other sister commissions and other regional organizations taking part to this exercise. As you will see in the presentation, there has been progress on the implementation rate, the overall implementation rate of trade facilitation measures in 2021. We are still lagging behind, but we have made some progress. Next slide, please. So, next slide, please. Okay. Mushara is playing with the stuff. I'm sure she's coming with it. Okay, great. Next slide, please. Okay. So, as you see in the survey, we have sent the survey to 50 experts in the 22 Arab states in the Arab region, and therefore the results cover 14 countries in the 4 sub-regions of the Arab region. The Gulf Cooperation Council countries, that's one region, the middle income countries, the countries in conflict, and least developed countries. Many Arab countries undertook reforms to facilitate trading across borders and to improve the overall doing business environment. Significant progress has been recorded in the implementation of the general trade facilitation measures. However, more efforts needs to be directed toward enhancing cross-border paperless trade and facilitating trade in times of crisis and pandemic. Next slide, please. Focusing on the core 34 measures related to the general and digital trade facilitation measures, the overall implementation rate in the Arab region was 54% in 21. Saudi Arabia was the biggest performer with an overall implementation rate of 85%, followed by Morocco, 83%, Bahrain and Tunisia with 72% each. These countries have embarked in a series of reforms that included upgrading their port infrastructure. Saudi Arabia, Jeddah Port, Morocco, Tanger Port, and enhancing work of the trade single window in Bahrain and Saudi Arabia, introducing e-payment system to process fees that was in Morocco, and deploying new scanners to expedite import and exports that was in Bahrain. Egypt is still facing challenges dealing with complex procedures to obtain and process documents, while Tunisia is still facing inadequate terminal space. Countries in conflict and least developing countries are still lagging behind in terms of implementation of trade facilitation measures, except Sudan, whose implementation rate was 67%, and Mauritania with 55%. These two countries, these the two subregions of countries in conflict and least developing countries are still facing significant administrative inefficiencies that make trading across borders more difficult. Palestine and Iraq had the lowest two performance rate with an implementation rate of 14 and 25% respectively. Next slide, please. Focusing on the implementation rate of 18 Arab countries who responded to the survey both in 2019 and 2021 trade facilitation surveys, the overall performance improved by 4 percentage points to reach 57% in 2021. This progress was mainly driven by the improvement in institutional arrangement and cooperation, which increased by 11 percentage points, and formalities, which increased by 9 percentage points. The implementation of paperless and cross-border trade is still relatively low and witnessed the lowest progress, particularly the measures requiring electronic application or electronic exchange information. In terms of individual countries' performance, Mauritania recorded the largest progress in with overall implementation rate increasing from 25 to 55%, and by undertaking progress in all categories, among which setting up an online portal for trade, putting in place a barcode for products as a step forward for digitizing procedures. In Sudan, the implementation rate increased from 60 to 67%, driven by an improvement in measures related to paperless trade and cross-border paperless trade. In Jordan, implementation rate increased also from 68 to 71% in 2021, driven by an improvement in measures related to formalities and paperless trade, including the expansion of the national trade window, which reduced cost and the time required to release goods and acceptance of electronic submission of custom declarations, trade permits, and trade cargo manifests. Slide, second slide, yes. Looking at the 58 trade facilitation measures, it can be noted that on average, transparency measures, formalities, and institutional arrangement and cooperation are the most implemented categories in the Arab region, with an average implementation rate between 61 and 66%. The Arab region is lagging behind in terms of cross-border paperless trade and trade facilitation in times of crisis and pandemic. The performance of the Arab countries was the lowest in these two categories, with an average implementation rate between 23 and 30%. In terms of trade facilitation in times of crisis and pandemic, many countries have formed a committee or assigned an agency to facilitate trade in times of crisis and emergencies. In Palestine, it was assigned to the Ministry of Economy, whereas a Corona ministerial committee was formed in Lebanon. In Palestine, the government has developed draft guidelines to deal with emergency situation. In Jordan, the government has enforced the implementation of several measures that facilitate trade and prevent the interruption of supply chain, like enforcing an electronic system to minimize the contact with borders management in the bare minimum, to the bare minimum, a special lane was also reserved for relief goods to speed up the clearing processes with the possibility of obtaining a prior clearance of document. The government also enforced the implementation of the crisis management national plan, which facilitates the trade of essential supplies during crisis and pandemic. I will stop here and leave the next slides to my colleague Soraya Zain to go ahead with the most implemented measures in the Arab region and proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Mukhtar. I'm going to move quickly due to time constraints. But looking at the entire Arab region, the most implemented measures fall within two categories, namely the general trade facilitation category and the paperless trade facilitation categories, where we have between 12 and 13 countries that have implemented, fully implemented or partially implemented these measures. Looking at individual measures, for example, stakeholders consultation received a large number of implementation from countries. Some countries like Jordan, for example, they publish all the draft regulations on the websites of the relevant ministries, and they invite the private sector to put on their comments before sending the regulation for approvals. Bahrain as well, they gather their stakeholders' opinions through different channels, including meetings or workshops. Aligning the working hours and procedures with neighboring countries, Bahrain and Saudi Arabia have introduced a pilot scheme using smart technology to streamline procedures to process trucks between the two countries. Looking at the least implemented measures, like all other sub-regions.
Next slide.
The least implemented measures, all those measures fall also within two categories, namely the cross-border paperless trade and trade facilitation in times of crisis. The implementation, the number of countries that have partially, fully, or pilot stage implemented these measures do not exceed 4 countries. In fact, many countries in the region have not been able to fully digitalize their cross-border procedures and to move to electronic exchange of documents and payments. Moving to the following slide, I will conclude here by saying this in this 5-step process to reach full implementation. It was noted that in the Arab region, the Gulf Cooperation Council countries and some of the middle-income countries have done pretty well in terms of implementing the first 4 steps, while they are a bit lagging behind in terms of implementation of cross-border paperless trade. The Arab region still needs a lot of support in digitalizing their procedures and in preparing for emergencies and times of crisis. The ESCAP is continuously ready to support its member states and in adopting and implementing the policies and in increasing intra-regional and international trade. I will stop here, and I thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Soraya.
Thank you very much, Mukhtar and Soraya. I am aware of the time, but let me introduce our 2 distinguished commentators. As I've said, as it was previously said, the survey is developed by collaborative efforts, not only it being a joint product of 5 regional commissions, but it is really supported by strong partnerships with many international and regional organizations. So the 2 commentators that I would like to introduce is out of these many partners. Firstly, I would like to invite Mr. Paul Hansen, Chief of Trade Facilitation Section of United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, UNCTAD, to share his comments.
Thank you very much, Sue, and good afternoon, good morning, hello to everyone. Thank you very much for inviting UNCTAD to join the launch of the global survey. We are pleased to be part of this initiative that is now well established and, dare I say, also a well-awaited and interesting initiative every 2 years. Secondly, let me congratulate the lead organizations for launching this year's survey, but also in general for the success of the survey, which has become, I think, a benchmark and a reference point for trade facilitation information and data dissemination. I think the numbers tell their own story in this. It is important for the UN family to be able to pull together for such significant contributions to the global and regional discussion on international trade, in particular to showcase also how trade supports and underpins the achievement of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. The 2021 survey documents and confirms what I think we already see in the field, namely that LDCs and vulnerable economies such as SIDS, LLDCs and countries in conflict seem to lag behind in trade facilitation, implementation and reform. Especially some of the more difficult trade facilitation reforms seem to be challenging, including facilitating digital trade, cross-border connectivity and collaboration across borders. And this only underlines the need to redouble our joint effort and focus and specific implementation assistance to these countries in collaboration with other stakeholders, including, importantly, the private sector. One note I would like to make on the issue of implementation rates would be that these rates are self-declared by countries. I think the question is how reality looks like. And in this context, it is important that governments between them and also with the private sector collaborate to monitor the actual efficiency of trade facilitation reforms. National trade facilitation committees are excellent fora to undertake such discussions, I believe. UN have many important tools and contributions in the field of sustainable and inclusive trade facilitation, and some of them have been mentioned here already by previous speakers. And I just want to highlight some of the tools and contributions where UNCTAD plays a specific area. We have a number of solutions that are complementary to the global survey and the work of UN regional commissions. First of all, we provide general trade facilitation, implementation and reform support in relation to the TFA, other international agreements, regional trade agreements, and trade and transport corridors. UNCTAD provides specific support through our empowerment program to national trade facilitation committees, focusing on fostering sustainable and inclusive public-private partnerships for trade facilitation implementation. And in this context, the UNCTAD online database for trade facilitation committees around the world very well complements the UN Global Survey with specific information regarding more than 100 national trade facilitation bodies. Also, based on this, we issue biannual reports on good practices for national trade facilitation committee. I should mention that the database now also contains a sustainability score per national committee, indicating how likely these committees are to be successful and continue long-term. Moreover, UNCTAD's ASICUDA program provides automated customs and trade clearance solutions for more than 100 countries and territories around the world. And this is a major contribution towards providing solutions for developing countries to enable them to achieve the SDGs by securing revenue and facilitating secure, safe trade based on digital, well-governed procedures and clearance. The system also provides data for statistical purposes, which is essential for fact-based policy decisions. We have other UNCTAD solutions and initiatives that complement UN's work in the field of trade facilitation, such as our E-Trade for All initiative, our work on women and small cross-border traders, our work on sustainable transport, and the tools on e-business and e-registration, including our trade information portals, which provide transparency for international trade procedures. Finally, let me also mention that we are, of course, aware that the repercussions of COVID-19, what they have had on our societies and populations. International trade has been significantly disrupted by the pandemic, and we are unfortunately not in the clear yet. Disruptions continue with the pandemic flaring up in different parts of the world. And at the same time, countries and the international communities are focusing on recovery from the pandemic, often referred to as building back better. In this context, I wish to mention also that the UN Department on Economic and Social Affairs, UNCTAD, and the 5 regional commission have launched a joint program for implementation of UN solutions, including standards, guidelines, metrics, that can help governments and business community worldwide to keep transport networks and borders operational and facilitate the flow of goods and services while containing the spread of the pandemic. And furthermore, also building sustainable, resilient, and connected supply and value chain solutions for better being prepared for the future, including for future crises. So let me end on this note by appreciating the collaboration between the various UN organizations, other international organizations, our partner countries, and the private sector, and that we are working in the field of trade facilitation together, having now contributed to the launch of the UN Global Survey 2021, and in general providing a range of efficient trade facilitation solutions for governments and the business sector with the aim of jointly achieving the SDGs. I invite participants in this launch, as well as the countries and the business sector, to make use of the survey data and the UN tools and solutions for joint implementation of efficient trade facilitation solutions. We are at your disposal and we are ready to collaborate. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Paul. Indeed, looking forward to continuing our joint collaboration on these issues. Secondly, I would like to invite Mr. Andrew Wilson, Director of Global Affairs of International Chamber of Commerce, to share his comments.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. I'm very conscious of time, so I'll keep my remarks extremely brief. First of all, let me say on behalf of the International Chamber of Commerce, congratulations and thanks to the 5 UN regional commissions, in particular to ESCAP, for what we think is a truly, truly important report. And I think I'll start by echoing and in some ways paraphrasing the comments made by the ESCAP Executive Secretary at the start of today's session, that the results of the survey do provide a very, very important roadmap for action, and one that we think is absolutely pivotal in the context of COVID-19, given the continued disruptions caused by the pandemic, which may, given the current speed of vaccine distribution, be a prolonged pandemic in many parts of the world. But also we recognize deeply that enabling trade will be an important source of stimulus for many SMEs who have been badly and deeply affected by the crisis. We see in many regions SMEs with tremendously weak balance sheets, significant accumulation of debt. Clearly they will need new forms of revenue and stimulus, and we think trade is an important part of that solution. So getting the enabling frameworks in place to support SMEs emerging from the crisis will be absolutely vital. And I think in today's report, we have a pivotal roadmap for action. One thing I just want to comment on very, very briefly is the value that we place from a real economy perspective in the holistic TFA approach, or TFA plus approach taken by the survey. From our perspective, when we talk to businesses, particularly small and medium-sized enterprises, trade facilitation is much more than just the TFA. And in our view, a holistic value chain approach is so very vital to achieve scale, particularly in the digitization space. On that note, I want to focus in on 2 issues in particular that I think are new to this year's survey: paperless trading and trade finance. So to start with trade finance, we very much appreciate the inclusion of this relatively novel subject within the trade facilitation space. And we think it is absolutely pivotal to the recovery from COVID-19. in our mind, we're seeing a little bit of complacency from many governments who essentially look at the trade finance market as it is functioning today and say there isn't a crisis or we've averted a crisis in the context of the pandemic. We think it's premature to make that conclusion. And essentially, although we've seen in previous crises sudden shortfalls of trade finance at the start of crises, thinking of the Asian crisis in the 1990s and the global financial crisis in the 2000s, we think this is a different dynamic that we're seeing today. And the real risks will ultimately present themselves when the cushioning effect of government stimulus programs starts to fully test the risk appetite of the global banking system. So clearly there's a need for continued vigilance in the market. We think there will be a need in the relatively near future for a scaling of credit guarantee schemes. And also, I think as importantly as the survey shows, there's a need to explore potential synergies between trade facilitation programs and the trade finance industry to see if the supply and flow of trade finance to the real economy can be enhanced. And a shortfall of trade finance beyond the existing $1 trillion estimated gap in the market could have a seriously detrimental impact on the survival of the small businesses coming out of the crisis. So this very, very important agenda, which we hope can really be accelerated following on from the survey results. On paperless trading, it's been great to hear about some of the emergency reforms that have been implemented by customs agencies and governments in the context of the crisis. We certainly hope, as we've made clear in recent WCO discussions, that those emergency reforms will be made permanent. There seems to be no reason to slide back to analog systems once the pandemic is over. But I think we need to put this debate in context. And we haven't, I think, seen the scale of digitization that we would like to see ideally to reduce what is a scourge in the global trading system in the form of paper documents and the complexity and the cost that they add to cross-border transactions. And just to give you one metric, we've seen tremendous digitalization in many parts of the economy. E-commerce has grown by 40 or 50% in a number of countries and regions. But if we look at the data that we have on the use of electronic negotiable instruments, that usage was less than 1% of the global market in 2020, and little changed from 2019, 2018. So very little growth in the use of digital negotiable documents. And that is something I think that we need to bear in mind as a reality check, that we just don't have the scale of digitalization that we would ideally need to see to provide greater resilience in supply chains, but also to reduce the cost of international trade. In that context, we see an absolute imperative for greater investment and greater focus in digital customs solutions, without any doubt. But more fundamentally than that, and this is one area where we're particularly keen to be able to work with the 5 UN regional commissions, is the need for fundamental or foundational legal reforms to enable paperless trade. The reality is, in many markets today, existing laws on negotiable instruments do not give full functional legal equivalence or full legal recognition to digital documents. And that is, in our experience working with businesses large and small, a major inhibitor to the adoption of digital trading processes at genuine scale. In this context, we've been advocating for several years now adoption by all governments of laws aligned with UNCITRAL's model law on electronic transferable records, MLETR or MELITA. And we think this is an area that requires particular focus. We've been delighted to see the G7 make commitments on the adoption of MELITA in May of this year, but we'd like to see more and more governments look seriously at this agenda as a way of really reducing the reliance of the global trading system on paper documentation. Finally, just to say one final point, we look forward very much to collaborating with the regional commissions and likewise member governments on the implementation of the roadmap set out by the report. The business community and ICC see this as an absolutely pivotal agenda coming out of the COVID-19 crisis, and we're happy to provide any support that we can, including through the ICC-led Global Alliance for Trade Facilitation, which is active already in a number of jurisdictions supporting the implementation of trade facilitation reforms based on the insights provided by local private sectors and drawing in the expertise, resources, and experience of global multinational companies. So we very much look forward to working with you on the implementation of some of the issues identified by the report, and in particular, speeding the adoption of reforms to enable paperless trading at scale. Many thanks.
Thank you very much, Andrew. It is spot on, acknowledging and noting the great work that ICC has been doing in collaboration on trade finance and also like legal reform on digitalization with a partnership with UNCITRAL as well. Now, I would like to re-invite Mr. Jan Duval to deliver a few words for the closing the event.
Okay, I cannot see myself, but maybe you can see me, right? Hopefully.
We can see you.
Okay, very good. I'm not sure what's happening. No, I mean, I think we are over time, and so everybody is extremely busy. So on my side, what I want to say is thank you very much to all the participants, to all the speakers, and also to the two commentators, right, UNCTAD and ICC. I mean, I think the session was very rich, and so a lot of takeaway and a lot of things to be done. Also, right, in terms of continuing to build capacity for least developed countries to catch up. I think this is something that is very important. And also a lot of things to do to enable cross-border paperless trade, which I think everybody is saying this is really the next thing in terms of making sure trade facilitation bear full fruits, right, for the benefits of everyone, right? Don't keep your electronic documents nationally, but make sure you enable them to be exchanged globally, regionally, globally, through legal reform, through technical solutions, right? And in the Asia-Pacific region, we very much focused on this through the UN Treaty on Framework Agreement on Facilitation of Cross-Border Paperless Trade in Asia and the Pacific. And we very much look forward to all the countries of the region and possibly beyond soon as well to join and really push forward the implementation of the framework, including adoption of UNCITRAL relevant instrument and also UNCFAC standards actually that have been mentioned. So on that note, let me close the meeting with a very special thanks to Sue that has been working very hard behind the scene on the project. Also Zhang Yuan, who has been helping a lot, and Salahin, who just put his video on, Sebastian, who is sleeping in ECLAC, and so many others, right, who've been working on this. So thank you very much, and I really look forward to the next round of the survey in 2023, right, if not before. Thank you again. Bye-bye.